So good morning again. This is Lacey Villava with Gunston Hall. I am joined here today by Rebecca Hall on the back end, and a little bit later this morning we'll also be joined by our archaeologist Dave Shanyo as we progress through the activities that we're doing this morning. We're going to talk about what survives first, how we're able to determine what might survive when we look in an archaeological setting. Then we're going to do some things that historians and archaeologists do, trying to help themselves identify objects that they find in the ground. And we're going to wrap up today with a tour of the archaeology lab. If you have any thoughts or questions at any point, feel free to pop them into the chat. We will let you know if there's a moment in time where you may want to express your question or thought verbally. But otherwise, we hope you have fun today. I'm very, very excited. We're going to get started with our What Survives activity. And you may wish to have some of these objects to look at. If not a problem. We are going to have some objects on screen. You may see on your screen the Gunston Hall top-down cam. I'm going to head over there in just a second and get myself set up so that we can do an activity. And while I'm working on that, you can get your supplies out here if you wish, and we'll get started in just a second.
All right, ladies and gents. So over here on this camera, I can't read your questions in the chat. So Rebecca is going to be reading questions off the chat for me so that I can hear them, and we will get ourselves started. So this activity, What Survives, looks at the things that are unlikely to have survived, things that might have survived, and things that probably survived. And I've got a big pile of objects here. These are all reproductions, not objects that are actual artifacts, but these are representative of some things that were around in the period. So I've got things like a loaf of bread, a glass. This one is a style and shape that was fairly popular in the 18th century. I've got this pottery pot, which clearly it's broken and not repairable. I've got a stoneware pipe, white clay. It's a fairly fancy one. I've got a broken candle. I've got a fork. Yes, it's got 2 tines instead of our usual 3. I've got a waistcoat, which is sized for a very small boy with nice wooden buttons. I've got a copy of the Virginia Gazette from March 21st, 1777. This fun piece is called a Monmouth cap, based on a place where one was actually found in history. A shoe with shoe buckle. A nice little notebook, happens to be blank, but models ones that we know existed in the 18th century. And a horn spoon. And a brick. So, does anyone have any guesses as to the kinds of artifacts we might typically find when we're doing an archaeological dig at Gunston Hall? Feel free to type them in the chat or unmute yourself and shout them out, and we will see if we've got an answer for you. Do we have any guesses, Rebecca?
We have one guess that just came through the chat. Someone is guessing the shoe buckle and possibly also the leather shoe.
The shoe and the shoe buckle. What a fantastic guess. Yeah, this might be something that survives. Any other guesses?
Not just yet.
A brick.
Oh, a brick. You think that the brick might survive. That is a fantastic guess.
We've got a guess about the glass.
The glass, we think the glass might survive.
We have another guess about the pot.
The chocolate pot. This is a chocolate pot, by the way. One of my favorite 18th century dishes. They have their handles on the side. I'm not entirely sure why, but 90% of the time chocolate pots have their handle on the side instead of on the back, the opposite side of the spout. All right, so we've got some good guesses on things that might survive. Does anybody have any guesses on why these objects might survive?
The brick is hard.
The brick is really hard, absolutely.
We have another guess coming in that the spoon might have survived.
Ah, the spoon might have survived. All right. So those are all really
The spoon will survive because it won't biodegrade.
That is a great thought. Thank you so much for adding that, because we think very much that the objects that survive are things that are less organic, things that don't biodegrade. So most of these things here are made from materials that were inorganic, things that were never alive. Glass is made from sand. Both the brick and the chocolate pot are made from clay, things that were never alive, as well as the shoe buckle. It's made from metal. The shoe and the horn might survive. They have to have the right conditions. Things that are more organic, so leather, of course, is made from cowhide. The spoon is made from cow horn. So these are things that might or might not survive depending on the conditions. But we do find bricks and pottery and glass all the time. So I'm going to put that over here in our probably survived category. And I'm going to put our spoon and our shoe in the might have survived category. We may not have the whole shoe. We'll probably have the shoe buckle. So I've still got some other objects. Anybody want to take any guesses on our other objects about whether or not they would survive?
The jacket, I think the notebook wouldn't survive because there's paper and water, plus paper makes goo.
That's right. Also, paper, the fibers that paper was made out of, in the 18th century, lots of paper was made out of fabric. And fabric has a tendency not to survive. So I'm going to put that in our unlikely to survive category. It's also, as we remember, from our scale of organic to inorganic, things that were once alive to things that were never alive. Paper is something made from something that was once alive. Any other guesses?
We've got some guesses in the chat that are really great. We have a guess that the fork would survive, and then we've got another guess that clothing would probably degrade.
Great thought. So the metal of the fork, more likely to survive. The horn handle of the fork depends on the category. So it's somewhere between the might have survived and the probably survived. And the clothing, our little vest for a young man, probably not going to have survived. Every once in a while, we'll find buttons and things, but typically buttons that are made out of metal or bone rather than ones that are made out of wood. Ones that are made out of wood sometimes just leave marks in the soil, discolorations that tell us where they were, but not the actual objects. All right, we've got a few more. How about my loaf of bread? Is that one
No,
likely?
it would go moldy.
It would grow moldy, and this one would probably be the first thing to go away. Absolutely. Anybody have any thoughts on our newspaper, our pipe, our candle, and our Monmouth cap?
The newspaper is not going to survive, like the book.
Absolutely. Yep. So where might we find this instead? We're not going to find this in an archaeology dig, but where else might we find this? Might we find this in a museum today? In an archive? Someplace that keeps old documents?
Lacey, I don't know if you can see from the device that you're working on, but we got some nodding when you said museum and archive, and I think that that person is right.
Absolutely. So we don't have any Virginia Gazette newspapers at Gunston Hall, and unfortunately, I'm not at Gunston Hall right now, or I would show you some. But we do have some newspapers in our collection, just not the Virginia Gazette. But that one is unlikely to have survived in an archaeological dig. So it goes over there in the unlikely to survive. All right, we've got 3 items left. Any guesses?
We've got a guess here that wax is pretty stable, even if it has some organic material in it.
It's a great thought. The likelihood that a candle might survive, however, is pretty slim. So this one is obviously broken, but the wax itself could get melted down and used for a variety of purposes. Making a new candle, polishing something, making a waterproof surface off of something else. So the likelihood that wax is ever going to end up in an archaeological dig to start with, pretty slim. But it's possible that it might have survived. So we'll put it in between unlikely to and might have survived. All right, last 2. Any guesses?
The pipe might survive.
Ooh, the pipe might survive. So we actually find lots and lots and lots of pipe bits in archaeological digs here in Virginia. We find lots of pipe bowls, this part of the pipe, and lots of bits, parts of the pipe stem. And I think we're going to get to see a picture a little bit later that has some pipe bits in it. So this one is in our probably survived category. All right, last one. Any guesses about this one?
Not survive.
Probably not survive. So this one is a little bit tricky. So it definitely wouldn't survive here in Virginia. Our soil quality isn't right for this to survive here. But the reason this cap gets its name, the Monmouth cap, is because there was a Monmouth cap found in an archaeological dig in Monmouth in the UK. So depending on the quality of the soil, how wet or dry it is, if it's acidic or alkaline, depends on whether or not things survive. So here in Virginia, absolutely unlikely to have survived. Now we put a whole bunch of stuff in the unlikely to have survived category. There's a ton of stuff that doesn't survive. There are lots of things, little things that will survive. Do you think we're gonna find any of these objects whole when we do an archaeological dig?
No.
No, probably not. We might find just the shoe buckle or part of the spoon, or like I mentioned with the pipe, just the pipe bowl or part of the stem. Obviously, this one might have been going into a trash pit, into what would become an archaeological dig, because it's broken already. And it would probably get broken further once it got thrown into a trash pit. So that's absolutely right. A lot of these things would be in little bits, and we're gonna spend the rest of our day today looking at some of those little bits and what we can tell about them through history. So I'm gonna switch back to my other camera. All right,
here we are back at our other camera. So I'm just going to get our screen share back up again. And this time we're going to be looking at a variety of objects that we have actually found at Gunston Hall. And Rebecca is going to talk to you about what they are. So let's get that going.
Fantastic. So we've got a question in the chat, whether trash pits are common at colonial sites. This is a really great question. From my experience with archaeology, what I can tell you is that in the 18th century, there were no landfills the way that we have them today. And so a lot of the time, people like George Mason would have an area on their property where they would just throw away things that were broken, things that couldn't be used anymore. And fortunately, those areas are like gold mines for archaeologists today. A lot of the time we can go through the artifacts that we find there, and even if the artifacts are broken or in smaller pieces, we can try and figure out what they originally were part of. So let's take a look at our next activity. So we just looked at a big variety of different types of artifacts, different types of objects. Some of them might have been found in archaeological sites and some not. Right now, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on artifacts that were actually found at Gunston Hall. Is somebody raising their hand? If you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself.
Is that an actual axe head?
Oh my gosh, you are so smart. You already have a guess for our first question here. So let me explain how this activity works. What we're going to do is we're going to look at a picture of an actual artifact that was found at Gunston Hall. And then in this first round, we're going to look at two paintings. And I'm going to give you guys about 15 or 20 seconds just to study these two paintings and tell me if you see this artifact in either of the paintings. And then if you want to shout out and say either painting A or painting B, feel free.
A.
Painting A. Oh my gosh. You guys are so good at this. So Lacey, if you'd like to move on to the next slide, we can take a look closer at this painting. It's a painting of a woodcutter and his family. And the person who guessed painting A is absolutely correct. This is, the artifact that we just looked at was an axe head. It was a real axe head found at Gunston Hall, probably used for doing some kind of carpentry or maybe chopping down trees. There were lots and lots of trees at Gunston Hall in the 18th century. And here we can see a painting that shows an axe head. This is a painting from the 18th century. And so you can see what the entire axe would have looked like when it was in use. It's entirely possible that the handle of the axe was also made out of wood. And that's the reason that the head of that axe survives, but the handle doesn't. So let's move on to an artifact that is actually still in the ground. So as we progress, these get a little bit harder. So take a look
Is that a bone?
That is such a good guess. Oh my gosh. This is not exactly a bone, but it does come from an animal. So that is your first hint. So I'm going to give everybody some time to study painting A and painting B, and then give me some guesses about whether you think this artifact that's still in the ground is...
They're oysters.
Wow, you are so good at this.
Does anyone else have any thoughts or guesses? Can anyone else identify them? Yep, I see some in the chat. Painting A, some more Rebecca.
Alrighty, let's wait a second and see if anybody else has any guesses. We have someone guessing that these are shells. Someone else says, I thought it was the remnants of a corset. You know, that is a really fascinating guess because there are certain time periods in history where corsets were also made out of animal parts. So guessing shell or bone is exactly on the right track, and it's not that far off from a corset. All right, well, I'm not seeing any more guesses coming in right now. So if Lacey wants to move to the next slide, we can take a closer look at this object. So this painting here, painting A from the previous slide, shows a woman who is shucking oysters. That means basically opening them up and getting the meat out from inside of them. We know that lots of people like George Mason, people who were in the gentry in the upper classes, were definitely eating oysters in Virginia in the 18th century. Oysters probably, the oysters that we found at Gunston Hall were probably not from George Mason's backyard. They were probably not from the part of the Potomac that he lived on. But they might have been from farther down the Chesapeake Bay, or they might have been from the edges of the edges of the Atlantic Ocean that touched on the edge of Virginia. So we've got a question in the chat about whether oysters were an important part of the colonial diet. Yes, they absolutely were. And Lacey's putting some more information about that in the chat right now. So let's take a look at our next artifact, if everybody is ready for that. This is a little bit different. It's something that was used for a very different purpose.
It's a key used to unlock a door and B.
So we've got a guess that this might be a key. I'll give everybody else a couple more seconds and see if they can hunt down this artifact.
Key.
All right.
There
So
is a great question in the chat, Rebecca. Looks like were keys as widely used as today? Absolutely. So many keys, so many places. And it was a lot harder to have universal keys in the 18th century as well. So a lot more keys.
yeah, keys like this were really important for unlocking all sorts of doors. This key, as everyone guessed correctly, it's a key, but it has a really interesting story. This key was found at Gunston Hall in a yard near the East Slave Quarter. We think that the area where it was found was a trash pit, but the fact that it was found near a slave quarter is really fascinating. It's possible that because it was found so near the slave quarter, that this is a key that an enslaved person at Gunston Hall was responsible for. They were using, but if so, that would be a little bit out of the ordinary. Enslaved people didn't always have keys that they were entrusted with. And so we have lots and lots and lots of questions about this specific key. And we have some answers. but we're always doing more research and trying to figure out more. So if we want to take a look at the next slide, we can zoom in a little bit on painting B and see that there is a key here. This one is a little bit harder to see because the details on the painting are not quite as clear, but there is a lady here who is holding out a key. And this painting is also from the 18th century. So let's see if you guys have any guesses about the next artifact. We're going to move on to, again, something a little bit different, but it might look familiar to some of you.
Is that a small picture frame?
Oh, that is such a good guess. We have a guess that this is a picture frame. It does kind of look like that, doesn't it? I forgot to mention this, but this artifact is smaller than your hand. So maybe it's a very small picture frame. We also have another guess that this is a belt buckle. I think probably because it's a little bit smaller, it's a square. That's also a really good guess.
Is it a shoe buckle?
Oh my gosh. We have a couple of guesses that this is a shoe buckle. Someone also guessed this in our chat here. And I thought that this one was really hard when I first saw it. I didn't really have an idea of what it was when I first saw it. But you guys are amazing archaeologists. And so we are going to take a closer look at painting A. If we focus in on George Washington's feet here, we can see that he's got buckles on his shoes. And this might seem kind of fancy to us today. Today we're more used to seeing shoelaces or maybe Velcro on our shoes. But back in the 18th century, at least in this part of the 18th century, when George Washington lived, it was very common to have shoe buckles on your shoes to help keep them on your feet. Does somebody have a question?
I would actually want to share something.
Sure, go ahead.
Before all of this started, one time we went to the kite festival and with a friend, and they were on that little hill part. There was a cup, an old cup, and a glass bottle. So we dug it up a little and gave it to the diggers, to the archaeologists.
Whoa, that sounds so cool. I wish that I could have been there to see that. But that sounds like a super fun experience. And we're glad that you got to come see Gunston Hall in person. Hopefully you'll be able to do that again soon.
We're very excited to be bringing people back, and the grounds are open right now, but our archaeology team isn't digging right this second, and we're not on site doing programs like this right now. We're still working largely from home. But if you're interested in going out and exploring the grounds again, you are more than welcome to do so.
Awesome. Okay, so we're gonna move on to round 2 of this activity. We've got a couple of artifacts left. The way that this round works is we're just gonna look at a picture of the artifact. So Lacey, if you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, we are going to study this photo of artifact number 5. And if anybody has any guesses, let us know.
Is the first one a pipe?
So we've got to guess that part of this is a pipe. That is such a good guess.
Or maybe the top of a long or maybe the top of a bottle.
Or possibly the top of a bottle. Yeah, it's certainly the right shape, isn't it?
Is the second one a piece of metal that a cannonball hit?
Oh, that is a really good guess. You see, I'm sure you're looking at the round shape here, and it kind of looks like the shape of a cannonball, doesn't it? So we've got another guess in the chat too, that this might be the neck of a bottle, or the top part of a bottle. And I guess that maybe this is the second piece here is a mold for a cannonball. That is also a really, really good guess. You guys are noticing the round shape here, and that is a great detail to notice. So again, everybody.
What are the pieces of paper? Why is there a piece of paper on the bottle and then writing on the other one?
Oh, that is such a good question. When we find artifacts, when archaeologists find artifacts in the ground, and they study them, they want to be able to keep track of what they found and exactly where they found it. So usually they will put little labels on artifacts. And if you take a look at the round piece here, and you see some of the letters that are written here, you can see an F and an X if you look really, really closely. And that stands for Fairfax County. That means that this piece was found in Fairfax County. That's a great question.
We're also going to be talking about this just a little bit more in our next section.
Yeah. So you guys have guessed some really, really great ideas. This is a really interesting example of two pieces that probably were originally part of the same object. So we think that the thing on the left was the neck of a wine bottle, and that the thing on the right was the bottom of a wine bottle. And the reason that the bottom is so curved is that this bottle would have been hand blown out of glass in the 18th century. And the bottom of the bottle would have been connected to the pipe that was used for blowing. And then when they finished the bottle and they wanted to separate it from the pipe where you blow through the air, they knock it off the pipe, and it can kind of create a little air bubble at the bottom of the bottle. Sometimes that is something that you still see in wine bottles today. So if we examine these artifacts more closely, if you were able to see them in person, then you might be able to tell that these are both made out of glass. And glass containers like this would have been used over and over and over again until they broke. So let's take a quick look at a painting where you can see objects like this. So there are lots of bottles in this painting. The ones that are easiest to see are circled in red on the table here, but there's also a bottle that's fallen over and broken on the floor. And if you look really, really closely, you can also see that there's a little bit of a broken pipe under that wine bottle right there, kind of like the pipe that we saw earlier in the What Survives activity. So now that we have looked at bottles, let's move on to our very last artifact and see if you guys have any ideas about this one.
Is that an earring?
An earring? That's a good guess. Yeah, it looks like an earring, doesn't it? I'll give everybody a couple more seconds.
Old-fashioned button.
An old-fashioned button. That is also a really, really good guess. So we've got a guess in the chat that this is a watch fob. Everybody is guessing lots and lots of accessories, and you are absolutely, absolutely in the right area. You all are very warm and getting warmer.
Is it a bead from a necklace?
A bead. That is another great guess. And actually, that's along the lines of what I thought this was when I first saw it. When I first saw this artifact in person, I had no idea what it was, but I thought, you know, maybe it's a bead, maybe it is an earring. But in fact, it's actually a button. It works a little bit differently than some of our buttons work today. This button was probably a sleeve button, but sleeve buttons in the 18th century would have been double-headed. So this is actually only half of a sleeve button. If anyone in your family has gotten dressed for a black tie event before, and they put on a tuxedo and they put on cufflinks, then you've probably seen something that looks really similar to this. These sleeve buttons worked the way cufflinks work today. So we are going to take a look at a painting where we can see sleeve buttons up close. So here, if you zoom in on Joseph Mann's sleeve, you can see that there is a button with two heads here, and it's keeping his sleeve attached to his wrist exactly where it should be. And this two-headed button would have been removed when it was time to take the shirt to the laundry, and the buttons would get put aside for their own protection, and then the shirt would be washed, and then the next time he would wear it, he would put the buttons back on. So it works pretty similar to a cufflink.
How do you wash the buttons?
That is a really good question. So it's probably likely that just a simple cloth might have been used to wipe off accessories like this. That is, accessories refers to, you know, jewelry and removable buttons, things like this.
And
that's a really good question.
We are going to see in just a second how our archaeology team washes objects like this when we find them and they look like this.
Amazing. Well, you guys were so involved in this activity. Thank you so much for all your guesses and for learning more about these artifacts. So I'm going to turn it back over to Lacey, and we have another exciting activity coming up.
So I've had a couple of great questions in the chat that I want to address. One of them is, how does the shoe buckle work? So I've got our shoe sample here, which has its shoe buckle on it. The buckle has these pins in it. Sorry, I'll hold it up for the camera in just a second, that fasten onto the back of one strap. And then the top strap gets threaded through and put on a second set of pins to hold it in and tightened up. And most of the time, the buckle isn't regularly undone. You just slip the shoe on with the buckle still tightened. But we do see some images of people walking around with their shoes unbuckled in the 18th century. And then the last question is, what was the cufflink made out of? And that particular cufflink, those sleeve buttons, were made out of metal and what we call paste. Paste is an 18th century word for glass. We're going to see a couple more sleeve buttons in just a second when we get our tour of the archaeology lab. So our signal in the archaeology lab isn't really fantastic. So the other day, Dave, our archaeologist, and I recorded a video in the archaeology lab, and I'm going to play that now. I am going to ask that everybody keeps their audio muted for the duration of the video so that it sounds great for everybody. And then once we get done, we'll have a question and answer session with Dave, our archaeologist. So I'm going to get that going in just a second.
These are some of the artifacts that we found in the past. We cleaned them up, and I just like to show them to you because they're kind of neat. This is the neck from a wine bottle, and this is the kind of bottle that they used in George Mason's time and even before. This is a shoe buckle. In Mason's time, they did not use laces on their shoes, they used buckles like this. You may have heard about these previously today, but these are what are called sleeve buttons, and we would call them today sleeve links or cuff links. And what's kind of neat here, well, these are cuff links that are still joined together. These are a pair of cuff links that have come apart. But the interesting thing about these is that they have initials on them. One of them has the letter G, and one of them has the letter M. And who do we know that has those initials? George Mason.
George Mason.
Okay. We found this near the kitchen, and it's a fork. And it's in very good shape. It has a bone handle, and this is an iron or steel part here, and you can see that it's sort of gotten all kind of messy over time, but we seldom find anything this whole in this good of shape. This is part of a pipe, a clay pipe, and the part that was smoked was stuck in the end here. And the cool thing about this, it's in the shape of somebody's head, and it looks like there's a crown up here. So we kind of think this may have been a pipe that was supposed to represent the King of England in George Mason's time.
Cool. And we've seen another pipe in an image earlier today that's laying broken on the floor, and we can see a head, not quite as fancy as this one, but there is a pipe laying on the floor in one of those images previously.
Okay. Okay, these are a couple of beads, and what makes them interesting is these are the kinds of beads that slaves often wore. So
what are they made out of?
They're made out of glass. They're made out the center part is a really dark green glass, and then it has this kind of reddish brown coating on the outside, and they always look just like that.
Do we know what they're using to get that reddish brown coating?
No, I don't. It was just another kind of glass, just a colored glass.
Okay, cool.
This is inside a plastic case just to keep it nice and shiny. But this is a coin that's dated 1774, and it has a picture of the King of England at that time there. And the King of England in 1774 was a man by the name of George II. It's kind of unusual to find coins here because at that time there was a shortage of coins. Now when we find artifacts, we put them in a paper bag like this. And we put them in a paper bag rather than a plastic bag is because it lets moisture come off the artifacts. If we seal it up in a plastic bag and they sit around for a long time, they get all moldy. But we put all sorts of things on here that tells us exactly where we found this stuff. Okay, and this information will stay with the artifacts as long as we have them. Now, the first thing we do when we get artifacts back in the lab is clean them. And I'm going to show you, well, we've got a lot of stuff in it.
You picked a bag at random that hasn't been cleaned, right, Dave?
Yeah, this bag has not been cleaned. And what our archaeologists do when they find artifacts, they find a lot of big stuff, but they also find things that are small and delicate and not get broken up. They go into the bag with the big stuff, and they put those kinds of things in a little container like this.
And we've got a very old film canister for those of you who recognize that, but we also use medicine bottles, right, Dave?
Yeah, because they don't make these anymore. Okay, now it's important to get this stuff clean, especially pieces of pottery, and we call these little pieces of pottery ceramics. Anything made out of clay we call ceramics. And in order to identify the ceramic and tell what its age is, we have to be able to look at the clay that it was made out of, and also the shiny area, this glaze on here.
Can you hold it up to the camera so we can see, Dave?
Sorry.
You can come a little closer still. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you see on the broken edge here, this is all dirty, so I can't see what kind of clay this was made of. So one of the things I want to do is wash that off. And we just use ordinary water. We use a toothbrush.
No soap, right? Just water?
I'm sorry?
No soap, just water?
Just water, yeah.
Because most of what we're getting off this is dirt, and it's all water soluble.
Yeah. Yeah, and we want to be careful when we get chemicals around this sort of thing, because some chemicals will damage the artifacts.
Gotcha.
Okay.
And these pieces of pottery, the ceramics, they also have a fun name, the small bits, right?
They're called shards, yes.
Shards. I've also seen it spelled S-H-E-R-D, shard.
It's spelled both ways,
Yeah.
right? Okay, I've sort of got a mix of glass and ceramic here, mostly glass.
I love that. Blue, is that 18th century?
And I don't think so. This is what we were talking about, is this piece. I don't know if you can see it here, but it's got some letters impressed in there. And it's got a little line going through here. And this means that it was made after George Mason's time.
Ah.
This glass was made in a mold. At his time, glass was mostly blown by hand. Okay, so we know this is not a George Mason piece.
And that's also why we get some of those irregular shapes in some of the bottles that we're looking at.
Yes, okay. So what happens is our archaeologists in the lab wash all this stuff. They put it on a piece of newspaper like this to dry. Okay, they keep the bag with it at all times so we know what all this information is. And after it dries, we identify the artifacts. Okay, now this is a bag of artifacts that have already been washed, and the person that picked them up off the drying paper has put them all in bags, and he left some of it loose, but most of it's in bags. And what we do is put things that are the same kind of material together. It makes it a little easier when we catalog.
So I can see in one of those bags you've got a bunch of nails.
We have nails in here. They didn't put the bricks in a separate bag, and that's something we often do not do. We have a bag of glass,
Okay.
a piece of glass.
Is that an arrowhead? Is that an arrowhead?
No.
Okay. It's kind of what it looks like at this distance.
Yeah, and a little piece of oyster shell here. And here's a bag, has a few little ceramic artifacts in it. I'm going to take these out. Okay, so what we have to do now is identify what kind of ceramics these are, and then put them on a catalog sheet. And this catalog sheet will be taken over to our computer, and the information from this sheet will be put in a computer. And I'm going to go through here and just put some things in here. This is artifact number 1. There's just one of them, and the material is a ceramic, so I'm going to put a C there for ceramic. The object.
That's really cool. It's a piece of white salt glazed stoneware, isn't it?
Yes, it is, and it's a handle of something. Now, white salt glazed stoneware is a kind of ceramic that George Mason was using on his table. So, and this stuff was made between the years 1740 and 1775, so it's pretty old. So I'm just going to write some things here. The object is a handle fragment. It asks me what the class is, so I'm going to put in stoneware. Okay, we put down various things here. It doesn't have a decoration. The condition, it's not. There's nothing wrong with the condition. Then it has a line here with dimensions, and what we do here is weigh it.
So for bigger pieces, do you measure them as well, or is it always weight?
We're going to start doing that. We haven't been doing it in the past.
Okay.
But it's a handy thing to have when you're looking for a piece of a certain kind of ceramic and you want a big piece. So you want to know that you're getting.
Exactly.
Okay, so we measure things, we weigh things in grams, and this is 2.2 grams, so I'm just going to write that in here. Okay, and then there's a line here where I'm going to put the date that it was here. It's 1740 through 1775. And function is well, this is something that was used probably on the table. This is probably some kind of tableware. It was maybe a cup or something else that had a handle on it.
Or a pitcher, a pot, something. Yeah.
So I'm going to put donkey food service.
Got it.
Okay.
So for example, if we found a nail, its function would be, say, construction?
Yes.
Got it.
Materials. Okay, now, in order to keep track of this stuff, we actually write a certain amount of information on it. We have, and we use a special kind of pen. It's a kind of pen that won't give off any chemicals later and hurt the ceramic. Write a number. Everything at Gunston Hall has this number, so we know where. So we know in general where it came from, in case it was this piece of ceramic was taken off our site somewhere and shown somewhere else.
So that FF44 FFX113-1 tells us where things were found. The 44FX that's everything in Fairfax County, right, Dave?
That's correct.
So when I used to work in Alexandria, which was also part of Fairfax County in the way that we catalog archaeological artifacts, all of our artifacts in Alexandria also had 44FX.
And the 113 just means that Gunston Hall was the 113th site
Within the county?
Within the county, yeah, to be found or recognized. And then I'm going to put this EU. You can see it anymore.
The EU
number, yeah, that says 8-19.
So is that the layer that it came out of?
That is that what we call units, the holes.
Excavated unit. All right. So we've seen what archaeological processing looks like here at Gunston Hall. And yes, we are wearing masks for our protection because Dave and I were in close proximity to one another. So we just wanted to make sure that we were being safe. The archaeology lab is functioning right now, but generally Dave has not been on site. And we are getting ourselves ready to go back in the field. I know Dave has some dig sites open and we've got Dave live here. If anyone has any questions, you can go ahead and type them in the chat or shout them out and Dave and I will work to answer them for you.
What's the biggest object you've ever found?
Oh, that is a hard question because sometimes we find really big things like the foundations of buildings, and we find roadways and walkways and that sort of thing. But we don't call those artifacts. We call those features. Things that we can pick up and put in a bag, we call artifacts. And I really don't know what the biggest thing was that we found as far as an artifact goes. We found some buildings, we found some roadways, and we've found things like that, fence lines. Those are pretty big, but we can't put them in a bag, so we call those features. Okay.
So we have another artifact related button or another artifact related question in the chat page. Buttons, the smallest artifacts you found. I think those are the G and M sleeve buttons.
The smallest things that we found, smallest artifact we've ever found. Well, okay. We do find things that are very small, like straight pins. We have found seeds in the ground. Under certain circumstances, seeds will actually stay in the ground and can be identified after a couple hundred years. And we actually found seeds. And I think those are probably the smallest things that we've actually found.
We found beet seeds quite
and we have to look for.
Go ahead, Dave.
I'm sorry, finish your.
We found beet seeds, which if I remember correctly, those are the ones that are about the size of a pinhead. They're wee tiny little things.
Yeah, very small, yeah, right. And another kind of interesting thing about the same size, we find very small beads and they're usually blue, but sometimes other colors. But these are tiny seeds that are actually, it's tiny beads, I'm sorry, that are actually sewn onto cloth. They're not used as necklaces or anything, but they're sewn onto cloth to make patterns. We find things like that here, and we find quite a few of those. So that's something that was apparently being done here with the clothing.
Zizi, I see you raising your hand. You want to go ahead and ask your question?
What's your favorite thing you found, and why is it your favorite?
I'm sorry, that broke up. What, we say that again?
What was your favorite thing that you found, and why is it your favorite?
Oh my goodness. You know, one of the favorite things I think were those sleeve buttons we showed you earlier with George, with the letter initials G and M. And that's the one thing we found that we can actually tie right to George Mason very personally. We think that that's something he could have been wearing. Other things he probably touched or anything like that, but we can't prove it. But we have evidence right here with the initials that this is something that was part of George Mason's clothing.
They're one of my favorite artifacts too, for that same reason. So we've got a couple more questions in the chat, a couple about what is your active site right now, Dave? Where are you digging at Gunston Hall?
Well, we kind of left off when we were still digging at a remains of a building that was a stable when George Mason was here. And the reason why we're digging there is eventually Gunston Hall wants to build another building that looks like that stable. So we're trying to find out how big it was and what the shape was and what are some of the things that it was made of. So they can, so when they do build that building, it can look as nearly as possible like the building that was here in George Mason's time. We found some interesting things because this building, I'm sorry.
Nope, continue.
I can't hear. Okay, this building was thought to still be here in the 1950s, and we're finding evidence now that the original stable building looks like it was torn down, and another building was built in its place, and that was the building that was called a barn later on. But the actual stable, remains of the stable are underneath the barn.
All right. What is the most unusual artifact that you have found?
Oh boy, it's tough questions. You know, we get asked these things all the time, and I say everything we find is interesting, and it is. You know, almost everything we find is part of a story and these artifacts kind of talk to us. The most unusual thing. Wow, that's a tough one. We found some things that are very surprising, especially when we're digging in where the slaves were living. So we're finding there, and we didn't know this, that the slaves were allowed to actually hunt for the meat. And they were actually allowed to use guns. And we found evidence of that. We found the lead shot that they used to shoot with, and we found remains of a lot of wild animals like deer, you know, possums, raccoons, and that sort of thing. In the trash pit that these slaves left behind.
You've also found smaller mammal bones too, indicating that they're doing some trapping as well. Isn't that right, Dave?
I couldn't hear your question. It was breaking up.
Sorry about that.
Could you repeat that?
Yeah, of course. So you've also found some smaller bones, small mammals like rodents, smaller stuff, that you think they have been using trapping to collect.
Yeah, right. That's correct. Yes.
All right. Next question. Are there any artifacts that you have not been able to positively identify?
Yeah. Yes, we find those all the time. You know, I've been digging out here at Gunston Hall a long time, but almost every day or so I find something that I've never seen before. Sometimes we can identify them, sometimes we can't. Usually the hardest things to identify are metal objects, because these are usually parts that have fallen off another larger object, and you just get a little part of something and you just really don't know what it came from. So
I remember in 2013 when we dug up that M sleeve button, which is a really cool story, by the way. The M was dug up in 2013, and the G we actually dug up more recently. I want to say in 2018 or 2019 when you were digging in the kitchen yard.
2018, when the kid, yes, 2018.
So we found those two buttons separately, but they're obviously part of a set. And you hadn't seen a button quite like that before, I don't think, Dave. And I looked at it, and I, having a background in textile history and spending a lot of time looking at portraits and sleeve links, knew that that was probably a sleeve button. And it turns out that some of our evidence since then has said that we've got multiple sleeve buttons and sleeve links that we found here.
Yes. Yes, and we might want to point out that both men and women used sleeve buttons.
That's right.
And some of them, probably most of them with the little decorative glass in them were worn by women. So.
Yeah. We've got another question. What is the object we have found on site that has come the farthest distance to be at Gunston Hall?
It come from the farthest distance? Well, it's kind of hard to tell, but it's interesting that that key that Rebecca Hall showed you earlier is a kind of key that was made in Germany. And when we've actually found two of those keys here. And when the day that we found one of them, there was a visitor here who was a director of a museum house up in Pennsylvania. And this was an area where a lot of Germans settled in the 18th century. And he said, this key that you found is a German key. And I'm not sure whether the key was actually made in Germany and brought here, or somebody just made a key in the style of a German key. But if that came from Germany, that's probably the furthest distance that we can identify an artifact.
We also have what's called blue and white, Chinese blue and white export porcelain that we.
Oh yes.
We've got things that.
Oh yes, we find so much of that. This stuff. Yeah, at the time, most of the time, the period of time that George Mason was here, they didn't know how to make porcelain in Europe, so it all came from China and Japan. So all this porcelain we find here, it came from a long ways.
You guys have asked so many awesome questions. Does anybody else have any last questions before we wrap up for the day? All right. Well, thank you all so much for participating this morning. We really appreciate you joining us. Please remember that we are continuing our Summer Saturdays program from now until the end of August. Our next Summer Saturdays is all about food, and we'll be focusing on food of people who were enslaved. We'll talk a little bit about some archaeology that Dave has done and how that helps us identify what people who were enslaved were eating. We're also looking at cookbooks and other resources that share that information with us. We'll also be talking about games. We're going to have one more archaeology session, and we've got one more garden session coming up in August. Thank you so much for participating with us, and I'll hang out here if anybody has any last final thoughts or questions. We appreciate you joining us, and we hope to see you next time.